So anyway, today I'll give a few thoughts on some advantages of starting with theory. So I suppose I've been talking about these things in this way fairly frequently these days. I was joking with Peter in the on the return to the hotel last night that I'll spend this time talking about the advantages of starting with theory, and then he's going to say something completely opposite, perhaps, in the next hour. So it reminds me of that old joke about the government employees. So we're from the academy, and we're here to help, or befuddle, or something like this. Anyway, so I have a little bit of an agenda. I have a big agenda, but for this session, I just have a small agenda. It looks actually a little bit long. But before we begin on the advantages of starting with theory, I'm just going to offer a couple of other digressions or random pieces of commentary about some of the discussion yesterday. And then I'm going to offer some boundary conditions of my talk, and this would be the equivalent of Gilad's lawyering up before he goes. So this will allow me to escape any direct criticism, hopefully. And then some reflections on post-result theorizing, which I'm using in place of HARKing here, just to do my part on label proliferation and so forth. But I sort of like this a little bit better because I think it goes to it sounds more general than coming up with an argument for a specific hypothesis. So I guess that's why I'm using it. And then talk about whether this type of approach is a success facilitating approach, which is what Starbuck called it, I think, a 2016 editorial, or it's a rejection creating approach. So I'll just offer a few comments from an editor's perspective and see what you think. And then just turn it over, I guess, and basically talking about the other end of the continuum. So what would some advantages of starting with theory be? And then what to do then next, a couple of thoughts on what to do. So before we begin, let me offer a couple of thoughts on replication. So I think, I don't want to sound too defensive here, but I think at the Academy Journal, sometimes we're criticized a little bit because of the mission. And some of it is in all fairness, and it's acceptable. But here's a couple of thoughts on replication. First, I favor them quite strongly, actually. And even if you look at my CV, you will see that quite a number of the papers, the projects which I have done, are essentially replication projects. Maybe you call them constructive replications or indirect or something like this. But they appear in journals like JAP and one fairly recently in SMJ as well. So I'm a strong proponent of them. But offer a couple of words of caution. First, I think as a field we do a lot of them. Maybe not directly so, but partially or indirectly or unintentionally. I mean, part of identifying your contribution is positioning it well compared to other previous findings and studies in the field. So I think we're replicating some sort of unintentionally or without that being our primary purpose. And in terms of the replication crisis, maybe there is a crisis, and I suppose I'm not 100% convinced there's a crisis, but maybe there is. I'm willing to think about that. But maybe there's also a crisis of over-interpreting the result of a single attempt at replication. I think that's pretty obvious to me. So this is an example that I like to give. Some are sort of convinced by it, and some others aren't. But this is a meta-analysis that my former student and I have in JP 2, 3, 4 years ago, something like that. And this is stem and leaf. I like stem and leaf depiction of the correlations found in the literature. So in this case, it's a fairly mature area, turnover rates and performance. So there are 300 of them, and this is the distribution of them. But just assume there was only one, and then you did the second one, even if it was an attempt at direct replication. So if you'll notice here, it's a little small, I realize, from the back. Actually, it looks smaller up there. Maybe I should just turn around. Uh, anyway, you'll notice that observed correlations in the literature range from negative 0.8 to positive 0.48. It seems almost like folly to take one study and then, even if you try to exactly replicate it, and then draw any conclusion. So you find something and I find something completely different. And what does this tell us beyond that we need about 298 more studies or something like this? This is what I think. So, I mean, someone like Paul or someone can tell me how many we need to draw, some reasonable conclusion. But it seems like that number is more than one. This is my point here. All right. And then the last thing, and here's where you'll think I'm totally defensive, but I'm just doing this because Gilad was using us as punching bag yesterday a little bit, which is all great. He's gone now, and we're on tape and everything, so he can see my response later. But here are some thoughts on bold, novel, and interesting theory, maybe as they apply to the AMJ mission. The way I think about this is it's like a stretch goal. So this is what we're seeking. Actually, if you look at the mission, it says that strong theoretical and empirical contributions are the papers that we are attempting to publish. But the recommendations on bold, interesting, novel, unique, and so forth, game-changing, those are all used with less strong terms, more like words of encouragement, like we seek or preference is given or authors should strive. So this is what we are striving to do. And I think it's totally fine in the field if we have certain journals who are emphasizing this type of thing. But even for those journals, we should think about this as what we are striving to do or encouraging authors to do. And that is not the same as saying that every paper that appears in the journal holds the same level of boldness, interestingness, or novelty. It's just simply not true. It's not like we're turning the pages and like, wow, that's incredible. Wow, that's incredible. It doesn't happen that way, right? But if there was a wow, that's incredible paper, then we want people to submit it. So that's the point. Anyway, so all of you collectively do something bold, novel, and interesting, and send it to the theory-oriented journal of your choice. Okay, so here are my boundary conditions or caveats. Back to my topic. They give me the microphone and I just get out of control. Back to my thoughts. So these thoughts are from the perspective of theory-oriented empirical journals. As one caveat, they probably apply better to quantitative, in fact, I'm certain they do, to quantitative approaches compared to other types of approaches. And even within those types of approaches, they probably apply better to those that are collecting primary, what I call primary data, where you have the ability to control measurement and so forth, and what is, I suppose, in your data set. And they are observations. My thoughts are just observations and opinions rather than from some systematic analysis. And they are from the perspective or the opinion of publishing success, like what would lead you to be somewhat successful. Okay, so how did we get here for this post-result theorizing or HARKing crisis? So maybe there's more publishing pressure. Maybe it's because we've trained our students poorly. Maybe we've done things accidentally, like handed over data sets and said, go off and play with them and see what you can find and so forth. Seems somewhat innocuous. It may be because data collections are, in many cases, much easier than they were in the past. It may be because the analysis tools are simpler to use or something like this. And it may be that there are explicit instructions from influential scholars to fish. So I actually looked for this presentation yesterday. I won't identify the person or the journal, but I was familiar with a presentation from a very influential scholar where one slide, which used to be available from his or her website, just said, here's how you publish in this journal. Get a data set and fish until you find something interesting and then write about that. This was the admonition to young scholars and so forth. So I looked for this yesterday. I wasn't able to find it. So maybe in the current current environment. Someone is like trying to erase this. Welcome, Joyce. Erase this from our institutional memory. Maybe incentives are misaligned. We can totally see that, as several pointed out yesterday. And maybe it's because of perceptions of global competition or something like that. So I don't know. There are lots of reasons. It may be, now here's where we can do some self-evaluation. It may be because of an emphasis on novel, bold, interesting theory, or emphasis on the use in review processes from reviewers and editors as well, on adopting or convincing us that you have an overarching theoretical frame. So I submit a paper, I get this comment, and then I go try to find an overarching theoretical frame and put it on top of my paper. So there are lots of reasons why. And so then we might ask ourselves about this topic as well. Is this a crisis? So Jeff and I were talking about this yesterday. My judgment would be that it's certainly prevalent, if not, well, it's very common, more than prevalent. Anyway, I would say lots of people and lots of places are doing it. How about that? And in terms of success, is there a crisis? Like, is it a success facilitating practice? I would say no, or maybe we don't know quite yet. But here are some observations. So my observations come from two sources. One is just experience, sort of what, like Steve was talking about yesterday, just being in the position of seeing everything that is submitted to a journal for some period of time. For me now, that's been about a year and a half, a little bit more than a year and a half. So when I started working on an editorial about this, I contacted some former editors, and this is the quotation from one editor. I won't say his name, but his initials are Jason Colquitt. And he said, you know, it's just so obvious in many cases that this is what has happened. So I think some of us believe that if you see all of the flow to a particular journal, there's some very, very obvious cases. These number not in the tens, but I would say they number in the hundreds over some period of time. And then I did a semi-systematic analysis of some decision letters from back in the day when I was AE. Not as many as some of these other workhorses in the audience, but here's my analysis. So this is a word cloud of the main comments in my letters, either in rejection letters or in revision letters. And the answer for which one it is collectively. Now it's time for participation. Do these come from rejection or revision letters? They come from rejection letters. Okay, thank you, Mo. All right, this is the word cloud for rejection. I realize there's selection bias here and all of this kind of stuff, so don't criticize my cause effect or my qualitative research skills, which I don't really have. But what I did was I just went through all of the rejection letters that I wrote, and I put into a spreadsheet my major comments, and then I sorted them and collapsed them into big categories. And so there are three that I guess are the modal ones, the most frequent ones. One is contribution, which you should read as lack of or insufficient theoretical contribution. One is construct definition problems, and the third is construct measurement mismatch problems, just not scientifically labeled, but these are the general categories here. Yeah, good. So we have some replication. All right, here's the one for revisions. So there are fewer revisions, of course. So, but still a good number over a 3-year period, as all of you know. So the first is you need to do a better job of applying the theory, or you need to do a better job of convincing us about the novelty or the scope, or you need to do a better job of positioning your paper in the literature, or convincing us about, you know, a reasonable motivation for this study and so forth. So I would say that these are all revision creating labels, and the others would be rejection creating types of commentary. And my opinion would be that many of the ones we saw on the previous slide are influenced by people who are attempting to retrofit a theory onto some pattern of findings that they have observed. All right, and you'll see in the workshop agenda that I have a short editorial on this topic, and just here are the warning signs, I guess, that I identified for post-result theorizing. The first is contorted theory. Our friend Peter likes to call us at AMJ the theoretical contortionist. You know, we're quite good at moving around. But this is a problem, right? There are a lot of papers with very contorted theory. I had a colleague come into my office some years ago and said, "Oh, I have this great finding, and here is the finding." And then he said, "I need a theory, and I need it fast." And so anyway, you can see here how that might be. So some elements of contorted theory would be arbitrary construct selection. I mean, you see this quite frequently in the review process. Kerr called it one side effect or one warning sign is the presence of the too convenient moderator, or you see papers frequently that have a different theory basis for each prediction. So these would all be warning signs that the study was not originating with some theoretical view that led to the completion of the project. Okay, that would be one. And then the other would be poorly defined constructs. So here we might see evidence like lack of attention to detail or missing construct definitions completely. Quite surprising to me how many papers, even reasonable quality papers, don't offer any definitions for key constructs. Or you might observe subtle changes to the constitutive definitions of the constructs that are somehow different than they were in the original work. And then we might also see construct measurement mismatch problems. This is very frequent. So here the operational variables do not match well. I mean, this is construct validity issue. They do not match those that were presented in the original work or as they appear in the literature. This slippage is very easily and very often recognized by reviewers and editors. And then this process of retrofitting or adding the theory later often means that variables are added or subtracted or somehow modified to produce what the authors believe is a better fitting or more convincing model. But this leaves signs, remember the old Brady Bunch episode where they're leaving a trail of popcorn through the woods. And this leaves some signs that reviewers and editors, I think, pick up on more frequently than not. Now, this is not to say that some people don't take this approach and they're good at it. And they do it well, and perhaps they are well known or something like this, and other people then look at them and try to emulate that type of approach. But I think most of us aren't as good at it as those people, and then we leave these trails in our papers, and it would be better to do something different in many cases. All right, and then the last one is theory design mismatch, and this is when the design is unable to test or even approximate a test of the underlying tenets of the theory, or the design cannot rule out any of the reasonable other plausible explanations and so forth. And this is another quotation from Kerr about this particular issue. This is a non-optimal way in which a treatment or measure was operationalized, or the absence of an obviously informative control, or the author's failure to measure a variable that is central to the purported mediating process when that was under the author's control. I mean, this is another point that Steve was making yesterday that I agree with completely. So you see very frequently that the study is simply designed in a way that is completely inadequate for giving us any information about the underlying theory of the paper. All right, those are some warning signs. So then how do we try to avoid those warning signs? Well, then you just look at the opposite end of the continuum, like don't do those things. And then you'll have some advantages, a stronger conceptual framing, clearer, more precise construct definitions, better matching between constructs and operationalizations, and tighter alignment or better alignment between the theory and the empirical designs. Okay, here are a couple of other, I believe, perhaps subtler advantages of a start with theory approach. The first is improved ability to articulate what your contribution is. So the way I try to talk to my team about doing it at AMJ these days is the answer to this question, which is challenge, change, or advance what we know. This would be about theory, or at a conceptual level, maybe a little bit more broadly. So less of an emphasis on this overarching theoretical contribution that became, I suppose, quite popular for a while, and more an emphasis on encouraging the authors just to tell us what you're doing or what you're trying to contribute in a simple statement. I believe if we can answer this question effectively, maybe in a single sentence or maybe in a couple of sentences, then maybe we're not halfway there, but we're on the way to convincing readers about the type of contribution that we're going to make. So just think about whether your paper challenges, changes, or advances what we know at a theoretical level. Let's say, if you ever come to interview where I'm working, you'll be asked this question: tell me in a single sentence what your contribution is. And frequently you get half-hour answers to this type of question. People simply don't know in a simple manner of articulating what their contribution is. So if we started with theory and we took a strong position or a set of assumptions, then I think we'd be better able to articulate how we challenge, change, or advance the literature. And the last is a better discussion section. So I know many of the other editors will nod their heads at this one, but it is quite amazing that how frequently people never mention theory again in the discussion section. And I think it's frequently because they don't know what the contribution is, because they didn't start there, or they had no intention to come up with what they came up with. And if we start there, I think we're better able to say something in the discussion section about how we challenged, changed, or advanced what we know. Okay, so what about post-result interpretations? So is there a place? So the answer to this, I would say, is a definitive yes. But how about at a journal like AMJ? So, I sort of like this Hollenbeck and Wright, or Wright and Hollenbeck editorial on HARKing and HARKing. Sort of interesting. So I think it would be possible or reasonable to do this in a submission to AMJ or some other theory-oriented empirical journal by elaborating on or discussing or speculating about surprising findings and so forth in the literature. So, you don't want to go on too long in an expanded discussion section, but perhaps there is a place for this, and I think we can be open to it. And then we could also view these types of findings as a starting point for later inductive or abductive. I don't want to talk too much about what Peter's going to talk about, but development. So you basically never see this in a submission to AMJ, where someone reports first a study with some surprising finding and then takes it in this direction and then follows it up with additional deductive approach. Just doesn't happen. I suppose for quantitative mixed methods designs, maybe you see something like that once in a while. but in terms of an empirical finding first that is somehow interpreted or explored and then later followed up with, I suppose more of a theory testing type of second or third study. You never see, but it would be possible to do that. Now you may not want to do that. You may just want to submit it to AMD and go there, and that would be a reasonable thing to do. But it would be possible. So I would say, but this would be transparent if we can borrow Hollenbeck and Wright's term. So some transparent HARKing that led to something else as opposed to pretending. So I guess my point of all of this is not to offer some ethical or moral or opinion, or to rap people on the knuckles for doing it, but just rather to say, my experience is you're better off not doing it if you want your paper to be published in this type of a journal. Let me preface that. All right, so what to do next? So because these are just thoughts, and perhaps it is a major crisis and we simply don't know, and I've just completely missed the boat, then someone could do a prospective study, right? There have been lots of ideas for how to determine whether and the extent of these practices, how they're influencing our literature. But someone could creatively design a prospective study to find out what happened in the author teams or with the author, and how the paper, the project developed, and then track the success or failure rates of these papers through the review process. So I don't know how to do that, but other people are more creative than I am. I mean, when you go to these websites, you often get a message to participate in some survey after you've gone to the website of your favorite airline or something like that. So I don't know if it would be possible to do this with a journal submission, maybe not, but there would be other ways of doing it. For example, contacting people at the academy or SciOp and getting a big cohort of people to participate in such a study. If you could do it in an even-handed way so people would actually report what they're doing, honestly, then it would be sort of interesting to see if there were any effects, positive or negative. So that would be fun for someone besides me to do. So for researchers, I mean, those of us in the audience today, just give it some thought, or perhaps give it a try. Whoops, I just went too fast for our celebratory picture. For training of students, so my training of my students has changed a lot over training students, I guess, for 21 years. And so now I adopt a slow to analyze approach. This works better for me. And the reason is, when I have adopted a fast to analyze approach, the thinking seems to stop. And then 2 hours later, a new moderated mediation model is appearing on your desk, and so forth. So this is what I do, is I try to encourage my students to be slow to analyze and long to think. The thinking frequently stops or gets all muddled once the models start pouring out, in my experience. Another is to put the theory handbook on your shelf to good use as opposed to pernicious use. So the theory handbook is quite useful for HARKing, because you go to the handbook of theories of social psychology, how many theories are in there? It's like 100, and you can find one that sort of plausibly fits about any model. So don't do that, but maybe just do some thought experiments. I do this very frequently with my students, and just give them a topic or a relationship or something, and I have them randomly, or not randomly, but I assign them some theory and have them design a study on that topic from the perspective of this theory. It's surprising how many times the model comes back, and even though it's a well-established theory, it doesn't seem to have been tested or precisely, to use Steve's word, and so forth. Used many times, rarely is it fleshed out in that way. I was giving another talk recently about this interaction between procedural justice and distributive justice. One of my favorite papers is by Brockner and Wiesenfeld. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say the name. This is from 20 years ago or so, and they talk about how common we find this given interaction and this given pattern, and here are some alternative explanations for why it might happen. So, I mean, for the life of me, I think 20 years later, we still don't know. But somehow we just accept this pattern as being evident, and it is consistently evident, even in my data. But I would say we still don't know exactly why it's happening. And there are still several plausible theories for why it might be. So why don't we just start there? This is just one example. Why don't we just start there and make some progress, as opposed to just showing the interaction and then speculating about why it might happen. All right. So put the theory handbook to good use. Mine are never in my office because my students know that I'll just give them the handbook. They just keep them now. All right, so for editors to make decisions based on quality of theory, design, and measurement, and not on patterns of findings. So we heard a lot yesterday about different things different journals are doing to try to improve on this particular dimension. It's great. My team knows exactly my thoughts on this, and I emphasize it very frequently with them, that we are making decisions based on the quality of these other things rather than on the stars in the table. And then last, I would just say sound a positive message for starting with theory. I already gave this away, but here are a bunch of people on my team who are completely supportive and happy, as you can see, about my opinions. I have the Elvis hair today, but not the Elvis glasses. Sorry. That's all I have, and no one interrupted me, so I don't know if that's good or bad, but
So we have about 20 minutes.
Paul.
I broke it. Can you hear?
Yeah.
Nobody
else can.
Well, anyhow. So, Jason, one of the things that I was, when I was an AE at Journal of Applied Psychology for a long time, there were these occasions where, as the editor, the action editor on a manuscript, I actually had to stop myself because I kind of felt like I was contributing to the problem, right? The manuscript might be interesting, it might have interesting data, it might have gone out, the reviewers might have basically suggested that the authors had missed this bit of theory, and then I found myself almost writing the letter to say, why don't you go back and re-theorize your whole paper basically around this thing. And it's challenging, right? Because if an author completely misses a theoretical framework that would have been perfect, have we just contributed to the problem of HARKing? So I just throw that out there because I don't know if I was in a unique situation, but my guess is many people who've been in an editorial position would have a similar thing. And I don't know that I've ever talked with anyone. I'm kind of curious as how they dealt with that situation.
Yep. You want an answer, or can I just throw? I've been waiting for a long time to throw. I want someone to run a route.
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty common, and it's really hard to draw the line because sometimes it's incremental and then a bit pernicious, right? So where the data are promising, the folks who envisioned the data collection really didn't have a good handle on an overarching framework or where the contribution could be, and sometimes reviewers or even a decision maker can get a little overeager in trying to help them find the gem. So I think it's a very real problem on the editorial side, is to be careful about that. I've also been on the other side of that, where you have a review team who's very diligently trying to get you to change your perspective. And that's always a little difficult from an author's side as well, because obviously you want to publish, but there are lines that shouldn't be crossed. So I think that's an issue.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing, I'm probably naive, but I'm not naive enough to be saying that You should start with the theory, and nothing ever changes until the end. I mean, of course, it's very dynamic, and things are going to change and be modified and so forth. So I realize that. So just in my personal approach, I try not to do that. Although it's hard to say just generally, I never do that, or I've never done that, because each case is somewhat different. But I try not to do it, unless then you would suggest that the authors do, you know, if you want a revision, then you're going to need to do the next step, which is not just retrofit the theory on top of what you have, but do a new study. Something like that. Okay, I think we have Jeff first and then Fred.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems to me that the obvious answer is, rather than not suggesting it, is to suggest that you thark. The more difficult, so in other words, you know, here's a theory that you could have and should have applied. Talk about it in the discussion, at least. Maybe mention it in the intro, and you don't, and say, this was suggested by a reviewer. And so that's the obvious answer. But the more complicated answer is, do you shark? And I'm not sure that that wouldn't be the right thing to do in some cases, but that's a much longer discussion, so I'll stop.
You'll have the microphone later, so.
All right. You know, stating the obvious, theory is not a monolith, right? So we need to kind of think about the instances of where we're encouraging theory or how we're encouraging theory and thinking. Like sometimes theory, more theory is needed might mean you're missing some key variables that are just critical in the scholarship. And other times, it kind of related to that, it means you're not thinking clearly. Like I you know, in editing, I'll hear a reviewer saying, more theory is needed, et cetera, and really the subtext is, I'm breaking up with you. Like, I don't get what you're saying, it doesn't make sense, or it does make sense, but you haven't read deeply enough, you know? So just any comments you had about how theory relates to thinking and how that plays out in your process. We don't want to hark think, but we do want to stimulate thinking in our you know, give researchers new ideas.
Wow, Fred.
Yeah, I know, cosmic. Yeah.
I honestly, I don't know what to say about that, except I think of theory as a way of thinking about something. But anyway, somebody have a better answer?
So Steve, you want to?
You know, I don't think we have a good handle on what theory is. We have a lot of variability in what the people in the field and across different aspects of it think constitutes a theory. Like I criticized boxes and arrows models yesterday. They're not theories, they're models. They're kind of focal frameworks. And within them, presumably there's some more overarching set of concepts that would constitute something that's more theory-like. I tend to think a good theory is a set of general principles from which you could generate a wide number of very specific models that apply in a particular context. Right, now, as part of the discussion yesterday, we're often agnostic about the context because that's why here the model might look this way, but under this other contextual condition, you might predict a different kind of outcome, or the nature of the relationships might be stronger or weaker and such. And I really think this is a big hidden problem in the field. I think Gary Johns has talked about it a lot, and people go, yeah, that's important, let's ignore it. And so I just see that as an issue. I mean, I've done some reviews with students where we kind of apply some frameworks to, let's say, leadership. You know, let's see how the work that's being done is consistent with broad frameworks that we might apply, like a multi-level framework, an input-output process model, et cetera. And one of the things that's come up in 2 or 3 of these exercises that I find really compelling is that there's no sense to the moderators, which virtually always implies some kind of contextual difference. There's no sense across the kinds of moderators that are being selected or revoked. So I tend to see that as if there's HARKing or trawling, it's most often going to be around moderation kinds of issues. And because there's no sense to it, it means the context as part of the theoretical framework isn't being brought to bear.
Agreed.
And I think a lot could be done to clean up the sense of rigor or the lack of replicability if we could bring a little bit order to that part of the space. And that's the domain of theory, really.
All right, so I just want to add to Fred's point, which is, well, the action editor does play a role in the whole process, which is you oftentimes have reviewers say, hey, should you apply this theory instead, right? But then action editor should provide clear guidance for the authors. And sometimes, well, it's not HARKing, right? Sometimes it's just the alternative theoretical framework obviously fits better, right? Then the question is, how does the action editor document the process, like bring this into the manuscript so people know, hey, well, the theoretical framework has been altered, right? So I think at JAP now we do let authors add footnotes by saying, hey, those are new hypotheses added in, right, after the revision. So at least we know, hey, this is a transparency-based practice. But I do see like sometimes the line is pretty blurred, right? Because sometimes a reviewer argues something, and well, as an action editor, you don't know whether that would necessarily lead to a better result, right? So then it's probably good for the action editor to, even more important, to provide clear guidance about whether the authors should take a reviewer seriously or not. Yeah, nowadays I think the editors, sometimes when you have 3 reviewers or you have, it's a little bit harder to do that kind of guidance, right? So, and the 3 reviewers could be all in the different place, different aspects, right?
Could be. I would. Those are good points. I like this footnote idea. I mean, there are different ways of doing it. The other way of doing it is just put it in the discussion. I mean, this is long ago now, but I have a paper with Shawbrock and some others in JAP where our pattern of findings in the review process, it was revealed that they fit another theory, quite perfectly well. But anyway, that's in the discussion of the paper. So here's what we predicted. We really didn't find it. But, here's another theory that seems to explain it quite well. And, maybe other people should look at it. No one ever did, but maybe if it was interesting or good, maybe they should see. Anyway, go ahead, Joyce.
It strikes me that we might answer this question differently if we're thinking about science versus publishing. And that thought has been on my mind a lot over yesterday and today. If we think about this from science, we should do all of this, and we should do it very transparently. And so I think sometimes the publication process starts inhibiting the production of good science, which always should be discovery and reevaluation and retesting and retheorizing and retesting and discovery and reevaluation. And so maybe we'd want to be careful about putting too many rules around this and just think about what would good science be in terms of contributing to what we know about management.
You can respond to that.
Peter, you seem thoroughly unconvinced by everything that I'm saying today.
I'll take it first if it's okay, Paul. No, I want to follow up with what Joyce just said, because I think I'm bouncing between the discussion is how much are we treating the symptoms and how much are we treating the underlying problem? Because as we've all, as we go here and we nod our head, it's like, oh yeah, there's lots of situations where you start and it gets redirected and things like that. My question is, do we have HARKing in that because we have just become very myopic and prescriptive in what the structure of a paper has to look like?
Yeah.
And if it deviates from that, it's not okay. And okay, so then I want to ask the question, well, why did we get to promoting a structure for a paper? And I know that there's, as we move to AMD, for us and other journals, as we've tried to be explicit in opening other types of papers, we're doing that. There's certainly the need for the type of paper that AMJ is doing, but I think the broader discussion is, yeah, why aren't we talking, so many of these discussions, so many doctoral consortia I've been to, so many junior faculty consortia are more of, here's the toolbox of how to publish, and it's moved away from, here's the toolbox of how to push our field forward.
Yeah.
So,
That's an interception, right?
well, I can't see behind me, and it was thrown right to me. What can I say? You can have it next. So the structure of the journal article that we take for granted has been in place for at least half a century in our field, and probably longer elsewhere. It doesn't have to look like this. I mean, we maintain that for the written print record, but how many people still keep their print journals? See, the Academy took away your print journals last year anyway. What'd you get for that? Nothing. No dues increase. But I mean, seriously, the form of a journal article is basically based on history and tradition now, right? And of course, our training, we're attached to it. We know how to do it. We're not about to give it up. But with journals going digital, what should a journal article look like? We have a whole extraordinary latitude in terms of what kind of documentation, supplementary materials, whether what we take for granted even ought to be the record. And there's been very little discussion around that either, because it's very wide open.
So can I answer now before? So I mean, your points are similar, and my intention was not to provide a toolkit. It's more a way of thinking about it's more a way of thinking. Let me just stop there. So hopefully people don't interpret this as here's what I think you should do in a step-by-step fashion to publish your paper in AMJ or some other journal, but just a way of thinking about how to approach a scientific project or something like that. I agree with both of the comments. Yeah.
I know I'm not mic'd up, but Jason, this is what I liked about your presentation.
Coming at you.
This is what I appreciated from the presentation is, I would say, I found it more true and clear on what you're looking for in a particular approach, but there's a dogma that I think sort of overlays our profession and management in general of what this looks like, and your discussion is much more nuanced and I think thoughtful than, look, we know what type of reviews we're going to get if we send a paper that look like this. And no matter what you say, that's happening because there's a belief out there. And so I think it's useful to hear that when the editor of the journal that, I'll throw you under the bus, say that I think promotes too much focus on novelty, says things that make sense and are not as consistent with Dogma. That's a good thing to see. How do we change our norms?
And I'll just remind everybody that Richard Blackburn published a poem in Personnel Psychology, and John Jermier published fiction in, was it Journal of Management? Elizabeth, do you remember? We read it recently. And so there, you can take chances and potentially get them published.
I've read lots of fiction in our journal.
This was intentional fiction.
So, to build off of a point that both Joyce and Miles made a little bit, I do think we should consider as a field really pushing the idea of asking people to do more randomized trials. And I've said this before, but an example of this would be one of my graduate students working with an organization, first year in there, and I was encouraging, think about what you're going to do. You're going to randomize something. You're going to have some people do X and some people do Y. And the organization wasn't receptive to it the first year because they were just a little leery about us working with them. But the next year, and to write up that first paper, it has all of these attributes that you talk about, because it's not, we know what we're doing, we knew what we were collecting, we knew what the deliverable was to the organization, but to make it into a publication, hard as hell. Next year, they were comfortable with us. We put in a randomization. We randomly assigned people to A and B. I mean, we know that from the very beginning, and writing that paper is a piece of cake, and there's none of this other kind of funkiness going on with it. And I think that we, as a field, should be encouraging our graduate students to think, because a randomized trial is very clear in how it should lay out at that point. And you may throw in some moderators because your effect is stronger or weaker, but it's a design fix to a lot of problems that we have. It's not the fix, but it is one fix, to some of them.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to Paul's initial point as an editor and the challenges that he faces. And I feel like, at least in strategy, we're not making the distinction between the research process and the paper as the product. Because what I've been hearing here in the past 2 days is around the research process. You should start with theory. If it's not theory, pre-registration of what you expect to hear, at least in your mind, in your own notebooks, and then go from there. But the paper that gets published serves two roles. One would be to communicate that research design process. It serves as lab notes for us as social scientists, but it's also a communication mechanism. You would like others to read the paper pretty easily, to follow it so that they can advance what you're saying. And a lot of like the formatting issues that we're talking may relate to the communication aspect of it. So having hypothesis theory, not necessarily in the dogmatic way, but as focusing devices for a particular reader may be helpful. And that's, I think, something that like too much emphasis on the other side of not having any theory at all, or putting everything as ex post discussion may lose, because that will get the reader very confused. So these are, I think, challenges that I'll face whenever I'm writing something. So I would love to hear thoughts about it.
Gosh. So, can you give me a more specific question?
So the question would be that, like the situation that you described, you have a theory, you start
Yeah.
with that theory, you run the analysis, you find some results, a reviewer will come back to you and says, oh, I think another theoretical lens also fits this model. Now you're faced with the choice to either integrate that initial theory in the upfront of the paper so that everything is cohesive, they can a reader can potentially read it later easier, versus going on with your initial thoughts in the upfront of the paper and then put everything that the reviewer said in the back end, which will be a more painful experience for a reader of the paper to read later. So I'm trying to make distinction between telling the story of how I did my research versus telling a story that my reader can understand better.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I agree completely. I don't think it's that confusing to say, here's what I predicted, here's what I found, and is somehow radically different or partially different. And here is another way of that would, it seems, explains it better, and so future people should take a look at that. I don't think it's that confusing. I mean, generally, maybe there would be some instant, I don't want to pick on the strategy folks too much, but these robustness checks, I mean, this is confusing, right? Frequently, this econometric tradition of pages and pages of robustness checks. So maybe this is useful, but it's certainly confusing. I don't think this is in the direction of transparency frequently. But I think just discussing how your results could have been explained by an alternative perspective is not that difficult to get. But there are other options. Like I was saying, you could just report your surprise or your unexpected finding as a starting point for then additional studies.